whatever else. So tonight, Big Muddy Speaker Series, we have Tim Amundson, who is a local artist, musician, man about town, founder of the Turkey Creek Institute for Phenomenal Awareness. And he's going to talk about Turkey Creek, and we'll probably have some phenomenal awareness. Tim?
Okay, yeah. So the Turkey Creek Institute of Phenomenal Awareness was an idea I had back in 2014, and it was founded, you could say. It's as much of an art project as it is an actual organization. And there's, in that sense, it's something that I've thought about, almost as a single piece of art in one way, in that it's like a sculpture or a painting, but with a different kind of edge. Like it has a different kind of frame. Like a painting is contained within a rectangle, but this thing I didn't really want to have edges. It has its subject matter, which is Turkey Creek, which we're going to talk about a lot tonight. And it's got this idea of phenomenal awareness, which is kind of the concept, I would say, right? So we have that word awareness, which a lot of art, I think, deals with now. People talk about raising awareness, bringing things to our awareness. In this sense, I wanted to kind of bounce off some of that and think about, like, how are we looking at this creek and what does it mean to bring it into our attention? Something like Turkey Creek, which is like really ubiquitous and very present in our lives without us knowing it. There's one degree to which just bringing awareness is being like, hey, there's a creek underneath I-35. You probably maybe didn't even know it was there. But another part of it was what kind of awareness is possible. And that's where this word phenomenal came in. Because for me, the creek was really revealed to me by being there and by observing the phenomena that was happening there. And phenomena I liked as this big umbrella term. I mean, it's kind of fancy and like brings about a certain kind of whimsy, a certain kind of poeticness, but also it's like this nice umbrella term for all of the phenomena going on there. And we'll talk about quite a few of those tonight because there's historical phenomena and social phenomena and economic phenomena and ecological phenomena and hydrological phenomena. There's so much to learn from the creek, and really all you have to do is go there. So one of the ways I started about working on this project was to try to bring people to the creek. So starting, I ran a show, or I had an exhibition in a gallery in April of 2016, which we called Floodplain Buyout, and that was held at Front Space Gallery here in Kansas City. And one of the major ideas of the show was to set up the gallery for a month-long process of programming. And we kind of had this conceptual idea of you would come to the gallery and be transported to the creek via a portal. That was like the metaphor. The portal was actually this like 1996 Dodge Caravan. And you got in the back. But, it's like it's portaled up a little bit. It's got some decorations, some energy flowing through it. So people would come out, this little cursor. People would come out and meet at the gallery, fill out some paperwork, kind of get accustomed to what we might be doing. There were different events. Some of them were workshops. Some of them were just open exploration. Some of them were directed at things like meditation or silent walking. We had different kinds of things going on every day of the month. And people would get into the back of the van and just be transported to the creek. So the other side of the portal is somewhere along Turkey Creek. So this is one of the workshops that we did. This was hosted by Jory Sakin, who's got his hand up like this there. And he's a writer and philosopher in Kansas City, and he did this workshop was about metaphor. And specifically, we focus on metaphors about water and moving water. So things like going with the flow, or I'm in too deep, or things like that. So we gather at the creek to actually do these things. So you could talk about metaphor in a situation like this, or a classroom, or wherever else, at the bar. But to be in a place and deal with the metaphor firsthand was kind of the idea. One thing I'd like to notice, everybody's wearing rubber boots. So one thing that this exhibition was able to facilitate, partly with the help of some grant funding from Arts KC, was we bought a huge variety of sizes of rubber boots. And the one thing this did, I think, was it helped people get out of their normal mode of kind of rules and routine, and you leave your shoes in the gallery and everybody puts on the rubber boots. And so everybody's kind of communally attached through this one object that they're all wearing. But it also kind of liberated people to step over boundaries they might not otherwise step over, walk in a creek. All these things that you think you can't do, suddenly you can do with the boots. So it gave everybody a little bit, like a baby bit of magic powers. This is a tour that we led in collaboration with an organization called Atlas Obscura out of New York. They had a worldwide fundraising day. They're building an interactive map online of various like off-kilter kind of oddity sites. So it's kind of almost like just like a catalog of weird things you could go see around the world. And we're working on classifying some areas of Turkey Creek along this, but this was a day of tours that they put together in Kansas City, and it happened to be our most attended event. We are just coming out of a tunnel that's about a third of a mile long and goes underneath Strasser Hardware. So everybody's just coming out of being in the darkness for about 15 minutes. Total darkness, like completely pitch black, and coming out into the light and being among Turkey Creek. Pretty good introduction to the creek. We also did some environmental and science-based workshops. I was able to work with what I call the resident experts. So I reached out to a number of people among all disciplines and asked them what could they do with Turkey Creek. And this was one that was hosted by Don Wilkinson, looking at different kinds of life forms in the creek, invertebrate life forms specifically we were looking for. So we're sifting through dirt and looking under rocks and then bringing them up and looking at microscopes to see what kind of life was in the creek, which is a really good way to test water quality. And I'll report back, even though this is pretty far up, we wanted to go far upstream to try to avoid contaminants. Still not a lot of life in this thing. So we'll get into why that is, but it's been through some things. We had lectures along the creek as well. This is Mara Gibson giving a talk. She's a dancer and choreographer and an artist, and she kind of talked about her relationship to water and how it influences her work. We had another speaker that was a landscape architect at this same lecture. And then we also, worked with artists. This was a temporary installation, collaborative installation by Tim Brown called Peleus, where everybody kind of took turns and also as a group kind of wrapped this sculpture with this saran wrap. It's not a permanent installation, we took it down, but it was very much about this collaborative process, and this was part of our kind of closing ceremonies for that exhibit. Really brought everybody together. Not everybody that had been involved, but a lot of people that had been to other events were able to come back for this one and kind of celebrate this month of celebrating Turkey Creek. We actually called it an opening ceremony because we were thinking about these ideas of opening the creek up to exploration and opening the creek up to more engagement. So we didn't really want to talk about closing the creek. And on that, I was wanting to talk about a little bit. The exhibition was called Floodplain Buyout, which the name came from this offhanded comment on this proposal the Army Corps of Engineers put together for the long-term development of Turkey Creek. And they proposed this to all the cities, communities along Turkey Creek, Kansas City, Overland Park, Merriam, forgetting all of them, Mission. Anyway, so they're proposing this thing. They talk about the options for how to do it, and it's in a PowerPoint I found online. And they're kind of coercive in this, but you can kind of tell just from the material. They have in mind what they want to do, and that's what they ended up doing, and they're in the process of it, which includes covering the banks in riprap, widening the channel, making the creek shallower, taking out the curves, taking out the trees, taking out just kind of like cleaning the whole thing up into this very systematic, mathematically calculated ditch. Taking as much of the kind of natural flow out of it, you might say. I don't always use those words, but just to kind of jump to that conclusion, it's a little bit of that going on. But they also use this term called floodplain buyout. So they put together this proposal. They had the prices for all of this, what it would cost to do what they're doing now. And then they put on this chart, like way up at the top, floodplain buyout. And it was like, they put it way up top so that it seemed like it was something impossible. But it was really only like 3 times as much as the work they're doing, which they'll probably have to redo. I talked to a number of hydrologists about this. They will have to redo it. It will probably flood anyway. But this idea of a floodplain buyout really stuck with me. Like the idea, just even if it's metaphorical, like even if it's a total impossibility, as an artist, it's those kind of ideas, those really ambitious ideas, these kind of impossible ideas that stick with me a lot of times, that really inspire me. So this idea of a floodplain buyout where like, oh, you could just buy the whole creek and just let it sit there, like it could become a post-apocalyptic wasteland where all the animals could like thrive again and we could go on these weird explorations, you know, like that just really, I loved that. And I knew it couldn't happen, but even as an idea, I wanted to carry that through with people and with this project so that we could enter the creek as if it was ours, as if it was no longer anybody's, as though it was no longer segmented into private property and kind of under the influence of the city and commerce and all this other stuff that affects the creek so much. What if we can enter it as though it was ours, as though we'd bought it out? And so that really kind of became the linchpin of that project, and it ended with this kind of final event. But let's move on to some maps, and we'll get more into the details of Turkey Creek. So I'm going to start out with these maps that came from Missouri Area Regional Council, Mid-American Regional Council, that's what it's called. This first one talks about the land use of Turkey Creek. You got, obviously first, so this kind of pink outline is what they consider the watershed. So all the water within this pink outline is flowing into Turkey Creek. One thing you might think to yourself is like, where's the creek in that? It's like mostly through the middle, but there's this line here, that's I-35. So if you've ever been south on I-35 from Kansas City, which I'm sure pretty much everybody who's ever lived in Kansas City has been on I-35 going south. If you've been to IKEA, you've been out to Blue Crossing Mall, you've gone to Best Buy or whatever. You've been on I-35, you've been all of these things. You've been above Turkey Creek, beside Turkey Creek, over it, next to it. It is built right with Turkey Creek. And that's partly, it's the same reason the railroad is built there. It's a valley, and we'll get into why it's a valley, but it's a huge part of the reality of Turkey Creek. You can't go anywhere on Turkey Creek without hearing the highway noise. And it becomes something of almost a meditative state. This is something we'll come back to, is like part of the magic of Turkey Creek is that it's both all the way natural and all the way man-made. Like the babbling brook sound that can be so soothing in the right setting can really harmonize with the passing cars. If you're just in the right place, it can be very peaceful, but then you kind of take one step in the other direction and you're like, oh my God, semis and like fast life. And you really, so there's this constant push-pull of like, oh, I'm in a beautiful place. Oh, I'm in a really damaged place. And so we think about the creek as a survivor in that kind of scenario. But I want to look at this usage. So obviously there's a lot of this single-family residential. That's what we call the suburbs, right? But right down here in the corridor, it's almost all commercial, industrial, this purple. You've got some of this which they call right-of-way, which is just kind of empty space, or owned by the railroad, or just kind of left empty by the railroads. But really, like, we have this green is parks and open spaces, which in this would be, you know, vegetative life. And even the vegetation and the parks are kind of offset. There's really not a lot. It's mostly just industrialized all the way to its beginning and to its end. And you can really see it in this one. This is the land coverage. So the pink is urban forest. This is Midtown. That's the amount of urban forest of Midtown. And this is the creek here. So you can get a sense from this a little bit, like how much feels natural. Like if you've, you know, driven around Midtown, Hyde Park or whatever, that's a lot more densely populated with trees than this entire watershed. And the blank is developed land. This entire area, the lower part of Turkey Creek, is all considered developed land. In fact, on some of the maps you can look at on GIS and stuff, it's considered a brownfield. But as you go out, you have little teeny bits right here of deciduous forest and lowland hardwood forest. You have just a little hair of that right here. Some of these are protected by parks. Some of them are just kind of left because they're not easy to develop. But the majority of this has been highly developed. In fact, it's mostly covered in concrete. And you can think about that if you're driving out on I-35. Like, what do you see? Car dealerships, box stores, parking lots. Everything is covered in concrete. And this has led, we'll talk about why Turkey Creek floods, but this is one thing that's exacerbated that issue. So keep that in mind. It's really covered in concrete. In a state prior to the development of the city, it would have been covered in forest. And when you have forest, you have loose soil, you have root systems, you have all sorts of things that soak up the water and slow down the way that the rain is absorbed into the ground. It's not just the concrete that makes Turkey Creek flood so easily, but it has exacerbated the issue intensely. And it flash floods every time there's a serious rain. It fills up quick and it empties quick. And we'll get into that a little bit more. These are some other maps. And Larry was specifically interested in me talking about some of this stuff, carrying over from a walking tour I did this last fall, which was in collaboration with a project called West Bottoms Reborn, I believe, which was in connection with Kansas City Design Center and the UMKC Architecture Department. And we were talking specifically, I don't know how well you guys know the West Bottoms, but right down off Santa Fe, and can't remember the other streets, but like down there, there's like Blip Coffee and the Ship, and like haunted house called Chambers of Edgar Allan Poe. There's a big parking lot that's always a giant puddle. Recently, they tried to fill it in with gravel, became another puddle. So one thing these architecture students were really curious about was this puddle, and it had some overlap with things I had done, because I started thinking about this puddle a lot as this kind of like phantom limb of Turkey Creek, because Turkey Creek used to flow through the West Bottoms, and this puddle kept emerging for the same reason water always emerges in a group, because it's the lowest possible point. And so why is the lowest point in Kansas City, or in the West Bottom, Kansas City's West Bottoms, why is the lowest point in the West Bottoms in a parking lot? And why doesn't it flow to the river? Like, you think, I had a friend tell me this once, which was really informative of the project. If you go downhill, you'll eventually reach water, and if you follow that water, you'll eventually reach a larger thing of water. And if you follow that, you'll eventually, keep going until you get to the ocean. And in the West Bottoms, that's a little bit it's a little bit misleading, right? Like that, if you're standing at that big puddle in the West Bottoms, it's uphill in all directions. So it breaks almost one of these fundamental laws of how the landscape should work. And so much of that goes back to Turkey Creek, and we'll just keep uncovering this over and over again. As we learn this history, one of the biggest points that's come out of this research for me has just been understanding how huge of a role Turkey Creek has played in the history of Kansas City. And this is more or less how it exists today. So in the red, we have Turkey Creek. This is the current flow. And this little bit right here is in Rosedale Park. There's little bits of creek. Then they go underground and end up at the creek. And this little bit right here is Penn Valley, which is actually part of the Turkey Creek system. Not a lot of people think it kind of goes that far to the east. But you do have a little bit of open water right there at Penn Valley also, which is part of the Turkey Creek system, and we'll talk about where that goes. But anyway, this is how it is now. Keep that in your mind. Moving forward, this is how it used to be. So you notice Turkey Creek ends right here in between Greystone Heights, which is the big hill, like when you're on Rainbow, I-35 right there, that big hill to your right. That's Greystone Heights. If you're going through on Rainbow, like into KCK, you're going right through that bluff. They carved a little let through. So that hill is important to remember. And then the other hill being Quality Hill on the other side of the West Bottoms, which is like downtown, the west side. Okay, so keep those two big hills in mind. But this is how it used to look. Now, there's some things to notice the differences. Turkey Creek used to run from here, this is a guess, right? Nobody was around in the Pleistocene to know, but it goes from back here all the way to the Blue River. And this area over here in the Blue River is it's just a little bit north, like if you were on Independence Ave going toward Independence, like where it crosses 635 and you go through that weird industrial zone that looks really apocalyptic and Blue River's all covered in concrete. Turkey Creek used to be there right alongside of it, and it made its way all the way there. You can still follow that valley, and if you think about where the trains go from Union Station, there's that kind of valley right through the middle of town, all the way past the East Bottoms, down all the way to the east to the Blue River. That valley is the old Turkey Creek, and was like that for millions of years. Not a big creek or anything, but was the low-lying area between the Blue River and the Kaw, and that was the drainage for it. And that valley's been another very principal part of how Kansas City's ended up the way it is, as they were able to bring railroads in. As a cyclist, you know about this valley very much so, because you have to ride up that huge hill on Troost or ride up that huge hill on Main Street. That's the old bluffs of the Turkey Creek Channel, which you can't see anymore, but it's there. It's there in its presence. That valley is where it is, and it used to go there. There's one other thing that's a little strange and different about this image. I don't know if anybody picked it up, but there's no Missouri River. So before the glacier, the Missouri River never came here. That channel, that body of water that comes all the way from Montana, never touched here. It actually joined the Kaw. I can't remember exactly where, but so a few hundred miles to the east of here. So we'll look at the next stage, and this glacier comes in. So in the red, we still have that old flow, just like the last map. This is kind of a layered map. I'll try to break it down, but this is kind of a timeline. I'm drawing a variety of periods of time on one map, so I'll narrate through this for you. This pink line up here is the glacier and its encroachment. So the glacier, the big glacier, the last big glacier from the last big glacial period came down to Kansas City, and it got to where we are now, and it stopped. Oddly enough, it really did. It took out Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota. It got to Kansas City and it stopped. It didn't even cross, like where we're at now, never got glaciarized. It got to the Kaw and it reached one lobe, they say, over. This lobe right over top of where downtown is now. It reached that one lobe over. And this is why we end up with the landscape we have. That lobe that crossed the Kaw, it backed the Kaw up for a long time, hundreds of thousands of years. And some of the water was able to flow through, but it created a whole mess. And the front side of a glacier, from what I understand, is like when the glacier's on an encroachment, when it's moving, it's creating this kind of torrential meltwater lake that's churning under the pressure of everything, and it's, lifting up the ground, and it's creating all of this chaos underneath it as it's dragging along. And during that process, it's backing up the Kaw, and it's creating this stage right here of critical erosion. That's a real term. Came from a geology book. So this critical erosion was happening right where we know the West Bottoms to be right now, along that bluff. So just to the east there, where downtown is, that's the blockage. Like, imagine a big dam, and the Kaw's coming down, and it's just creating this big, violent lake that's just churning right there. And it's churning and churning against this bluff that's separated Turkey Creek and its little zone, which was very little at that time, from the Kaw on the other side. So they've been separated for millions of years, and slowly this blockage of the Kaw is churning at the earth and chewing it up and bringing those two bodies of water, those two channels, closer and closer together. This takes place over a long time. I'm going to jump ahead for a second just so we can get a sense of time frame. So this is the entire history of the earth. And this is the Quaternary period, which we're in still. And so Turkey Creek, we know, is back throughout at least the Quaternary period, has flow in the area. That glacial encroachment's happening from about like 500,000 years ago to like 1/3 of a million years ago. These are really rough estimates, but that critical erosion time, once the Kaw is blocked, we're looking at about 250,000 years ago. The yellow is this next thing I'm going to talk about, the blowout. So now, imagine yourself staying down where Boulevard Brewing is, right? Boulevard Brewing is actually the old confluence of OK Creek and Turkey Creek. And from there it went into the West Bottoms. But that is because there was this blowout from the pressure of that glacier and the backing up of the water and that critical erosion that's been happening for years and years and years and years. That's why there's two hills, right? Greystone Heights is one hill. Like if you're standing at Boulevard, you could look to your left. There's one hill to your left. That's Greystone Heights. And there's one hill to your right, downtown, west side, Quality Hill. And then there's this valley in between, right? Like, I don't know if you guys know La Esquina Gallery or Cesar Chavez Road. If you're going over Cesar Chavez onto Kansas, it's a valley, right there. That's where the glacier breached. And upon that, the Kansas River was actually able to jump and flow down. It was able to jump into the channel of Turkey Creek. This also happened further upstream. There was another breach further up the Kaw, and there was another one further down the Kaw. But it did this in a couple different places. So I'm sure it was just a mess. But for a while, the entire flow of the Kansas River was going down the Turkey Creek channel, which is why it's such a big valley. Because it was a big river flowing right through the middle of town. Not where we think of it now, but right through the middle of town. It was flowing. And as the glaciers receded, that area filled up as a lake and drained slowly, which is why the creek now is filled in with this kind of loose sediment that we see after glacial periods. Because it was a lake, it slowly drained down through that blowout and into the West Bottoms. And that's what created the West Bottoms. It's filled with that sediment. It's It's like if you filled up a sandbox and you let it flow down, and there's that soft part of the sand that looks kind of wet at the bottom. It's more or less like that. It's just the flat part at the bottom of the drain. And for a long time after that, that was the new confluence of Turkey Creek. Does that all make sense? Okay. And that was just right before the Holocene that all of that happened. So when these guys were walking around, woolly mammoths, whatnot, saber-toothed cats. Okay. So the earliest written history we have of the area goes back to the French settlers that lived in the West Bottoms. And from their earliest map, we know that Turkey Creek used to confluence with the Missouri River and never touched the Kansas River. It confluenced with the Missouri River at more or less where the Healthy Rivers Partnership is. Santa Fe and Woodsweather is basically right where the confluence would have been. So that was up until 1844. And in 1844, there was a huge flood that totally wiped out the French settlements. And they came back, or those that survived or newcomers came back to the area and found that the creek had entirely shifted course and had a whole new confluence all on its own. So they had no explanation for this, but it moved from where Healthy Rivers Partnership is over to like over here where the Kemper Arena is, all on its own. And this idea of it being able to jump that distance and knowing this whole geographic history has led me to the hypothesis, and I haven't seen this anywhere else, and I'm not an actual geologist or a hydrologist or anything, so this is a hypothesis, that the wake of all of this, the West Bottoms was more or less a delta, a drainage delta for Turkey Creek, and probably jumped from one side of the West Bottoms to the other side of the West Bottoms, as rivers do in deltas. So as of up until between 1844 and 1922, Turkey Creek just flowed right here. And I didn't include this picture. This is from, but you can see here. That's actually a picture. It's probably hard to see, but there's photo evidence of when it used to be in the West Bottoms. And I'll explain next. Why don't we see it in the West Bottoms anymore? It is still there, just a little bit. So Turkey Creek was flowing down. The road to Merriam, out to Merriam from Kansas City, was being developed, what we now know as Southwest Boulevard. There were new businesses going in. We can look at the accounts people wrote from this time. And every time there was a big rain, because of the loose soil and the amount of flooding that happens along Turkey Creek, the creek would change course entirely. It jumped from one side of the road to the other side of the road, take out the entire road. They had to redo the road, build the bridges over and over again. And the flooding was still bad back here. I didn't mention this, but because of that geographic shape that it took after the glacial period, because it had an entire river running through it, it's high on the sides. It's like crafted like a bowl, so it just really drains water fast when there's big rain. And this was a serious problem for the people trying to build businesses there as this city's coming in, and the railroad is now going through that as the easiest corridor out to the newly developing frontier and all of this in the Southwest. So it was really important to not have this flood just wiping out all of the development all the time for these people. So they proposed this sewer, which is in this top picture. It's a little hard to see, but this is the Caw. It's coming from over here, and it goes like that. And the West Bottoms would be like over here. And this is like that Cesar Chavez, Kansas Ave is going like this. And this is Southwest Boulevard. So the proposal was to build a sewer underneath Southwest Boulevard and into the West Bottoms to drain Turkey Creek. Now at the time, this is like turn of the century, a little bit after, it was the largest sewer ever proposed. And they built it. When it was built, it got headlined in Popular Mechanics magazine, largest sewer in the world. But in order to build that sewer to get all of the water underneath that road and into safety, they had to build this diversion tunnel, which is here. And the diversion tunnel is like pretty magnificent. We'll talk about it more extensively here in a second. But they built this diversion tunnel where basically all of the flow of the creek went underneath Greystone Heights. So underneath this giant, hard limestone bluff, they dug a tunnel. It's huge. It's like much bigger than a subway tunnel. It feels like being in a cathedral when you're inside of it. And they dug that and diverted the creek down that way so that they could keep the water out of the valley below that in order to build the sewer. It's a little unclear to me from the research I've done, just the way that they've written about it just makes it confusing if they were intending most of the water to go through the sewer or go through the tunnel. But as it is now, the bulk flow of Turkey Creek goes through the tunnel, and whatever doesn't go through the tunnel further downhill goes into the sewer, and then whatever else groundwater is pumped through that sewer. I included some other pictures here, just left over from that other walking tour. This is where we were standing that day. That's where that puddle is. This was during the 51 flood. And we counted up that day. This 51 flood, the water was up 3 to 4 stories depending on the building. So when it goes over that dike, it can really do something. And then this is that area. So this area here in these two photographs, this is standing on kind of the south side of the west side bluff, looking down over where Turkey Creek used to go. So it used to come through that breach is over here. Boulevard is like over there. The breach comes through and it courses down, or it used to course down like over here and into the Caw up until they finished the sewer in 1922. So yeah, that's just another view of that. And this is more or less, I drew this kind of like an alternate version of present day. All of the stuff we don't see in that first map. So you have today's flow of Turkey Creek in the red, going down to the diversion tunnel and this dam that they built to keep it from Southwest Boulevard. The green here is the sewers. This is really hard to see on this. It was originally printed, but that's the Union Station, which is, interestingly enough, so OK Creek I didn't really get into, but it was a small creek that ran in the back channel of the old Turkey Creek. So remember we talked about that lake, as that lake was draining, one side of it's Turkey Creek, the bulk of the backflow, and the other side ended up being just OK Creek, which is just a little creek that flowed into Turkey Creek. And when they built Union Station, I still don't understand just the ambition of that time period. They built it directly on top of OK Creek. So there's still a flowing creek underneath Union Station, smack dab underneath it. You can go, there's a lower level of Union Station not a lot of people know about. There's a road down there called OK Street. You go to OK Street and there's manholes all along it. Put your ear to the manhole, you still hear the creek flowing. And there's in the corridor, like if you're going out to the skywalk at Union Station, they have old photos of the construction, and you can see them. Like they just dug right into the creek and laid the foundation smack dab through the middle of that building, and then they put a tunnel in, and a tunnel from that construction still in place today. So that's this part of the sewer, and that runs in right down into like underneath. Basically right underneath that corner of Boulevard Brewing where there's that underpass for the trains. That's the spot where those two creeks confluence and then go into the West Bottoms from there. And then the other part of the sewer would be the older system of Turkey Creek, the backflow that goes down into the Missouri over here, which is a sewer that runs the stormwater down into the Casey water treatment plant down here. I also added in, these black lines are the highway systems, just to give you an idea of how the city has sprawled out from this center. And then there was this question mark that was left over from that last tour because we were really questioning what is underneath the West Bottoms and why is there not a creek? Why is there not a regular water flow? And I did a lot of research trying to answer this question. I even went to the water department, looked at old maps. It's a mess underneath the West Bottoms. You wouldn't believe it. There's pipes going every which direction. There's pipes called sludge pipes. There's old pipes that were put in during the old clay pipes that were put in during the earliest like stockyards and stuff that are broken and just go to nothing. But anyway, the water in that area is just like a sponge. It just drains down and out into the rivers from there. So, and that also included some of our toxic waste. That was just kind of for fun. It was a little environmentalist jab. We got just a nice variety of toxic waste in the area. So how am I doing on time? Fine? Okay. So I want to finish up talking about this place. So I've had some distance more recently from this project, and people ask me, is it still ongoing? I'm like, is there still a creek there? Like, I don't define this anymore. The level of involvement is continuing up to a certain point, but I did have to take a step back, I think just mostly emotionally, because of what I'm about to talk about. So this is where the project started for me, was this little waterfall. This is at that diversion tunnel that they dug. The creek would flow on the other side of this hill up there, but it now comes down. This is the beginning of the diversion, so that what they call the dam is on this side, and it's coming around this curve and over this waterfall that was kind of formed over a longer period of time. It's not a natural waterfall, but it had been there long enough that it took the form of a natural waterfall, and it felt so displaced and weird. When I first walked up on this place, it was just like super magical, right? Like, it was just like, where am I? What? There's a waterfall here? Like, there's a creek here? Like, how is this possible? And then it was like covered in this weird spray on concrete, and you like walk down into this weird channel, and you're like, I am in a foreign place, like totally foreign place. And there was this amazing push-pull that happened there, because like we relate to waterfalls in a certain way. This is one thing that became really interesting to me as an artist. Like, why do we think waterfalls are beautiful? Just water going downhill. It's doing what it always does. But there's something in the sound. There's something it like stirs up something that's very deeply embedded in us. Some kind of instinctual understanding. I don't know if it's clean water or what it is, but like there's something beautiful about waterfalls. And beauty is a hard thing to explain. But this place, it really got slammed with a lot of things. It's impossible not to feel that waterfall is beautiful. But at the same time, you're in like the weirdest, most man-made place that feels like totally off-putting. And the water smells weird because there's a sewer treatment plant up the way. There's like pumps of water all full of detergents, and it still kind of has like a sewagey smell. So you can't quite figure out what's going on, but you're like drawn into this waterfall. And it really became the impetus of the whole project for me, because it was like, just totally fell in love with this place and was like, okay, I gotta know what the rest of this creek is. How have I lived in this city for 10 years and not even known about this creek, not even really noticed it? And talking to other people and realizing nobody really notices this creek, that we all drive over it all the time and nobody goes down there. It's not nobody, but very few people spend time with it, think about it, and know it. And let alone this place was just like very secretive. So one of the first things of this project, before I even had a name for it or started thinking about it in terms of art or anything, just consisted of taking people down. Like, oh my God, I know this crazy spot. Please come down. I'll show you this from the same night, pointing the other direction. I've taken a lot of photos down here. Sometimes it just has a magic all of its own, and you don't know to expect it. But it's really changed lately, and it's been hard for me kind of to continue feeling the same way about the creek and feel the same passion and ambition to connect with it, because it's changed so much. But yeah, here's some people I took down. The water on another day. So a little bit, this is springtime, it's a little bit more of a flow going on. These are some architects from BNIM that I took down there. We were looking at a project building a bike path along Turkey Creek, which ended up getting shut down due to funding issues, but had a lot of fun down there. This is what it looks like on the other direction. So you can kind of imagine what it was like walking down there the first time. You're like all forested in with weeds, and you're like, there's a giant driveway that goes like down at a 45-degree angle, and you walk down and there's a waterfall at the bottom. This is it on a rainy day. You can see the water's quite a bit higher. I'm standing up kind of on the concrete cliff, or on the one side there are kind of shelves you could stand on. You notice as it picks up water, it's picking up also a lot of sediment, which gives it this nice big muddy look, right? It's like chocolate milk. This is it on a really rainy night. So this is from the same spot, like almost exactly the same spot as this picture. So like this whole edge down here, and this whole wall like up to there, all underwater. This was 3 inches of rain. This was torrential. This was terrifying. This was one of the loudest noises I've ever heard in my life. There were waves that would smash up against the rocks and like hit us in the face with mist and stuff, and it was just smashing around. Until you can be there, that's like the phenomenal awareness thing. You have to engage directly with the phenomena to really understand this thing. What is Turkey Creek? Well, like being there that night was terror. It was like actually awesome. It was like really hit you in the bones to see this quaint little stream that you've spent a bunch of time suddenly turn into like a terrifying raging whitewater river. And this is it now. Well, it's actually worse than this now. This is a few months ago. This was the day after I did a boat tour with Healthy Rivers and KCDC and that project. They've dammed it up here, so there's a little lake on the other side, and they built these support systems to try to hold it all in there. The entirety of the creek is supposed to be flowing through this pipe here. It's worse now because like even this stage was like kind of cool because the rocks that I was so used to looking at were like free of water, and I could walk around on them and really see what it looks like to like have 100 years of water rolling over rocks. But this is all, I don't have a photo of it, but this is all like chipped away with a jackhammer now down to like a 45-degree angle. It really makes me sad. I don't know why. I mean, it wasn't natural or anything before. It was a man-made thing, but it's like, it's hard to watch these things go through changes, and the creek is going through so many changes. This is from another view. You can see some friends down here for scale. But yeah, it's messy. It's torn up. It's a construction site. And it's hard. It's hard to go down there for me. I got a little bit of retribution this day. This was after a big rain. This is the creek. It's supposed to be going down through that tunnel. This was a big rain. It blew out. The dam stayed intact. There was water over it. We know because there was a flood gauge here. You can't see it probably in the picture, but there was a flood gauge that was like one of those small I-beams, like an I-beam, like an iron I-beam, not the big one, but the smaller one, that was bent down at a 90-degree angle from the water pressure. Steel beam bent down at a 90-degree angle. So it had gone over the dam and still had enough pressure left over to blow out this entire side of the hill. And it backflowed into this entire excavation they had, which is just this huge hole. You'll see in another view. And it flowed down into that, and there was a torrent. This right here is the water line. So it was deep that night before. We didn't go down that night. We went the next day. And just seeing, I mean, this thing was completely covered with water. There's some debris up here you can see. And the windows are all smashed. I'm sure it's completely destroyed. And it turned this whole thing into an island. So this is an older picture. This is what it used to look like before the construction. There's a friend walking down here. That's the same spot now. But that was after that big dam breach. This is all clear and dry now, but you can see It really just smashed everything up that they were working on. This is a before. This is when they first chopped down. This used to be like all forested over there. It was like extra weird. And they started chopping down the trees. That was the first sign something was going to happen. And that's pretty much the same spot now. So the whole hill is gone. This is like really one of the biggest excavations I've ever seen. And what they're doing, they're putting in this culvert here. And they have this first section all laid in now, and this is all drained, and they've poured a bunch of concrete over here to keep the water out. But eventually this culvert will run all the way underneath Southwest Boulevard to, I want to say Rosedale again because it's still in my head. It's Roanoke. Roanoke Road comes down the hill, Roanoke Park. So that's old springs that are part of the Turkey Creek system also. The conservation just opened up some of those old springs. That's part of the Turkey Creek watershed too. And at the bottom of that hill, I guess they've been having flooding issues. So they're doing this, I think $3.5 million project to connect tunnels underneath all of that down to the diversion tunnel. Right now, all that water goes into the Turkey Creek sewer. So now they're trying to divert more of it into the tunnel, which is not really what the tunnel was initially intended for, but I guess that's what they're up to now. This is the big hole. So the way it was prior to this construction, you would have only seen the top of these trees from this perspective. This was a hill. It was a hill all the way across. And there was that one little driveway right there. And it was a hill on all other sides. So going back to this place after being there hundreds of times, taking hundreds of people to this place, it can just weigh on me a little bit. Like it can, I feel a lot spending time and then going there and feeling this gap. It's still worth it. I wish I was spending more time there, but, and there's so much to learn. There's so many new things happening, like when this happened and there's like a crazy breach and like, I wish I could have been there. Again, you can see the water line of how high it went. It's right there. So this was a torrential lake. It would have been, it would have felt like a micro version of what happened during those glacial periods. I wish I could have been there. And I guess I just throw this in to think about an emotional aspect to all of this, because that's another thing I'm supposed to deal with as an artist is like emotions, right? And there is an emotional element to this that I haven't talked about as much in this project. But we feel for things in the environment. We do. Like as humans, we have empathy for trees. We have empathy for rocks. We have empathy for flowing water. And it's undeniable when you've spent time with a place and with a body of water like this, for it to change and undergo these things. I think the way we're cultured, we're not supposed to think about it or feel it too much. But I've talked to construction workers that hang out down there. Even the construction workers are not numb to it. It's easy to make these decisions when you're sitting in a boardroom, when you're looking at numbers, when you've got investors like Boulevard Brewing and REW Materials and Shooty Lumber all looking at their quarterly reports and how the flooding is affecting them, to make a decision like this and to push for taxpayers to fund a $3.5 million potential mess. But it's a totally different thing to know that place and to go and feel what it is to change this place. So I guess that's really all I have. This is a nice one. That's the entire creek flowing through one pipe. So, but it's beautiful. That's the other thing is like, there's always beauty there. Like there's always something to find. There's something magnificent to me about seeing the entire creek shooting out of the sky. Like, it makes no sense, right? There's a creek in the sky. Like, I'm standing under a creek. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But, yeah, there's always beauty to be found there. But there's something lost, and I feel that. So I was going to end with this a bit of Turkey Creek that got to live in the Central Library for a little while, but after that, I'm just opening it up to questions from here on out. Thank you, guys.
Questions?
Where was that last picture taken? Was that the sewer or the?
This is the diversion tunnel.
Okay.
So this is You can't quite. I mean, you can get quite a bit of a scale for it here. The sewer it was the biggest in the world, not because it was big like the tunnel, like in terms of just like monumental feeling. It's just long, and it's a double box sewer, and it goes from basically like from Rainbow all the way to the Kemper Arena. And I guess at the time, like 1918 to 1922 was when it was being constructed. That was the biggest one. So there were larger irrigation channels, but technically for a sewer, I guess it was the biggest one. But this is the Diversion Tunnel. It was finished in 1918, which it says up at the top. And yeah.
Have you been through it?
Yeah, a number of times. The first time, we just went down that driveway for the longest time. So much of us involved with this. And there was always this like, what happens if we go down? And we really had we were so new to the exploring, had no idea. So we just like brought a canoe and got in, not realizing. It's like years later we realized once we had the rubber boots and everything, it was like really shallow and you could walk down into the tunnel most of the time as long as the caw's not high. But early on we just never went that way. It was just like the mysterious unknown place. So we like got on the boat. We're like, okay, we're gonna go. They took a picture of us waving goodbye, and we got to right to the edge and didn't know there was like a drop. It wasn't like a steep drop. It was like a wheelchair ramp. But the front of the canoe's like tipping for dropping. It's like shoom, and the call was really high and backed up into the tunnel. So we hit the bottom, and the canoe just went straight in, right up to my neck. I was in the front of the canoe. And I turned, the last thing before getting out of the boat was I turned around and just saw my friend in the back of the canoe just like dumping it because he realized we were just like gonna totally, and we lost everything. And luckily, he caught his feet before it was too deep. I was where I couldn't touch. I had to pull myself back up the boat, but yeah. But since then, I've realized, put some boots on, walk along the edge, you can go right down into it, which is what we're doing here, and you can just walk in. I've been there when the caw is at the very lowest, and you can almost walk through it till the very end. But you can do it in a boat. I've done it in a canoe going the other way. Take a canoe in from the caw. And I know people do it in motorboats all the time. They go in there and fish and stuff, so. It's awesome when you're in there. That sound. I mean, it's just like this big, huge, cavernous area that's just totally dark. It feels like very strange, like being in a dark cathedral. Any other questions?
Where is it? Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Where is that? Where does it empty out?
So, like if you're on Rainbow, the 7th Street Bridge, Rainbow and 7th Street are like the same road. Mm-hmm. It's just to the east of that Rainbow 7th Street Bridge. So when you're on the 7th Street Bridge, don't do it if you're driving because you can jerk your car. But if you were a passenger going over the 7th Street Bridge from the south to the north, like going towards KCK, you can look out to your right off the bridge and see where it comes out. It's just right there. And then, it's just on the other side of that bluff. It just goes right underneath.
So it's quarter mile, half mile, something like that, south of Kemper Arena.
Yeah, pretty much upstream on the caw. Yeah.
I saw those pictures of the construction, but I still didn't understand the blowout that we saw on the Kansas River that day we went up there.
So when this breach of the dam happened, right? Let's go. That breach, this whole thing was excavated and it was clean on the bottom, right? So you can see this is like the level it should have been at, like right here. So all of this dirt plus all of this rock that was down in here all washed away. So this was the water line. So these are the stages of draining. So I'm imagining just all of this rock and detritus that was in this hole they dug, just all got pulled out and down through the tunnel and just when it hit the Caw, it just built up and made that kind of island. Which that little kind of island there has always kind of been there. It just got built up more. But you're talking about the blowout on the side of the tunnel? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm just talking about whatever caused that island.
Yeah, the island. Yeah, I think
it's a whole lot bigger than. Well, we had the sewer plant guy there with us. Has been with him for 30 years, and he's been up that tunnel several times, and he'd never seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's this hole was never there. This is the side. Like I said, this was a hill from here to here. This was a hill. Now that hill, like all of that earth, which is huge. I mean, this is like the size of a football field. Most of it's up here, but enough of this flowing with water. I mean, the water was up to that level. Like we could see, like you can still see in this photo. Those are water bottles and other trash. The water was up that high. That's like, I mean, that's like at least 10, 15 feet that was deep with water. So I'm sure it was carrying all sorts of whatever was in there. And that grade is not really what you get from, that's the grade of a drainage. That's water drainage. So I think just that thing filled up with water and carried a whole bunch. I mean, you fill up.
A lot of what it carried was old bricks and ceramics.
Oh, yeah. Well, that dam, my guess was that this is what they call, so when you look at the old construction models, or the from that Popular Mechanics, that's where I've gotten a lot of the source material on how this construction process went. They talk about building the dam. So this was the dam, right? So they had to build up the earth to make sure that the creek didn't go back to its old flow. And my guess, because you go around this site, you'll find old ceramics and old bricks, all sorts of weird stuff. My guess is that they just took a bunch of landfill and dumped it right there to build the dam. That's my guess. That's an unfounded hypothesis based on just phenomenal awareness.
And the awareness of what we saw out on that island.
Yeah. No, I think that they just built up the earth right there. But also, this is another important thing to think about that I didn't bring up. We didn't really get into some of the socio-cultural history of this area. But this area, I mean, this hill up here, Greystone Heights, is still known by some people in the area as Hobo Hill. But that harkens back even further. This was an area, it was just outside of Kansas City. It was on the Kansas side. So if you remember, like, Missouri was founded and was a legal state, and Kansas was still kind of in the gray area. And so just on the Kansas side, the easiest access point was like the Wild West kind of place of Kansas City. So this was an area, it was called Blacktown, and it was inhabited by American Indians that were retreating from various Indian wars and other kinds of persecution in the East. It was inhabited by freed slaves that had gotten out of the South and along the Underground Railroad. It was outlaws. It was, all sorts of people that didn't have the same kind of constituents. So it was inhabited. So there's elements of that too. I'm sure a lot of it was just buried in when they built that dam. I'm sure that. And then what was left of Blacktown, from what I've heard from the locals, was all taken out under eminent domain when they built I-35. So there's really no trace. You don't really feel the traces until you get all the way up, the traces of civilization along that bluff, until you get all the way up on top to Greystone Heights. And up on top, there's still, there's some newer houses, but you see some old looking houses up there too. And so I think it's just a really old part of town also that you just has been through all these changes.
Well, that explains where all that, all the bricks and ceramic came from. Mm-hmm. No cars in that dam, but
yeah, everything
else we could use. Any questions? So the thing about, I just wanted to wrap this up with, I think it's really interesting that we're looking at geological changes, and we look at man-made changes, and we look at how the creek has been this way and that way, and what we've done to it now, and yet you can still go down there, mm-hmm. and that water calls to you, mm-hmm. no matter what it is, and it's. it really mystifies me how long we've been on this planet and we still don't understand water and how much we are water. And I tell parents it's water calling to itself. They've done studies where you can put two glasses together and it will actually form a bridge, the water. So it does try to move to itself, but that's why little kids jump in puddles. So continue to jump in puddles and be phenomenally aware. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you guys.